Hi guys! For those of you who don't know me, I'm Téa, and I'm going to be doing an analysis/breakdown of my 2024 United States Extemporaneous Speaking NATS winning speech. So before I begin, here's a little bit of what to expect from this breakdown. So first, I'm going to be going step by step through what my flow would look like and how I ordinarily set up a speech. That will be through each part corresponding to my speech. Throughout it, I'm also going to give more context about NATS in and of itself, what final rounds are like and how they differ from, say, a preliminary round, and also just my thought process going through my speech and about NATS in general. And of course, there'll be little pieces of advice, suggestions of how you can improve or how you can try to focus on certain skills throughout. Starting with the speech.
All right. Our sixth and final speaker is code 5537, answering the question, are the institutions of the United States democracy rising to the challenges of the current political era?
Recently, President of Mexico, Andres Manuel López Obrador, made an incredibly bold statement. He alleged that there is more democracy in Mexico than there is in the United States. But while we're definitely quick to judge, let's not forget that they've already elected their first female president. But even beyond that, there's a kernel of truth to what he said. The Brookings Institute...
Every speech is going to begin with an AGD, an attention-getting device. And those can look really differently depending on the speaker and what their purpose is in that speech. So the one that I just delivered was one that's humorous, which is something that you'll see more often than not when it comes to AGDs, unless you're in a speech that's more humanitarian-focused or very emotional inherently. But AGDs really can be anything, depending on who you are, what you're good at, and kind of what caters to your own style. They can be humorous, informative, emotional, and more. The possibilities really are endless. The other thing to keep in mind with AGDs is that different styles of humor work differently, and sometimes well and sometimes poorly, for different people. So a perfect example is I like to do AGDs, especially when they're humorous, that are more story-based. So in this speech, in the national final speech, I told a story, essentially, about something comical that had happened. I was talking about something that AMLO had actually said. Some people, in contrast, take Jacqueline Way as an example. She is an excellent deliverer of punchline-focused AGDs, like something that's a little bit more set-up payoff and is less grounded in a particular event that has happened. Neither of these is inherently better or worse than the other. It's all about what is focused more on your style of humor and what you're good at delivering. What does need to be in every AGD, though, is a really strong transition from the comical or emotional part that's more isolated from the rest of the speech to the actual background. So here mine was, there's a kernel of truth to what he's saying, because I needed to get a corn pun in there somewhere. But it is a way to truly take what I was saying in my AGD and connect it to what I get into in my background. That can really make or break any AGD, particularly ones that are a little bit of a stretch. That connection is how you convince the judge that you put thought and intention into what you were trying to open the speech with, rather than something that was canned or poorly thought out. So transitions are often overlooked, but they're absolutely critical to making sure that your AGD actually feels relevant and insightful, even if it's just some sort of cheap punchline joke.
Explains on January 6th of 2023 that on the January 6th, 2021 insurrection at the United States Capitol, many Americans saw democracy being challenged in front of their eyes for the very first time. And it brought it as an issue to the very forefront of the American collective conscious. As a result, the Biden administration and the presidency has centered democracy as an issue to fight for. But despite that, ABC polling from February of this year found that 82% of Americans believe that democracy is under threat in the United States. Now we have the 2024 presidential.
Okay, so for the purposes of the background, I wrote out what my flow looks like here, just to make it easier to visualize what it is that I'm talking about. So first we have the AGD, which I already went over on the previous slide, the joke about AMLO, the transition using the corn joke into the background. Then the background, the context, and the statement of significance. We'll get to the statement of the significance on the next slide. We're worrying about the background first. So the way that I set up my background has two pieces. First, the background, and second, the context. And these each have their own specific and unique role that makes a background feel more structured. So, background, for the purpose of that, the first line or the first component of the entire background functions a bit like the Council on Foreign Relations backgrounder articles that you probably have come across at some point during prep. It's the big overarching textbook context of how we got here. So in this particular case, mine is pretty broad. It's not particularly specific. I'm talking about how recent controversies surrounding democracy have brought that as a voting issue to the forefront of many Americans' minds. So that's okay. Why are we talking about democracy? Why is this relevant? What has happened that has caused us to somewhat get here? Then is what I think is the most critical part of the background. The context. Not everyone does this the same way, but the way that I think about the second half of my background is by asking myself the question, what landed this particular question, this slip, in the pool for draw? What recent event, what update has caused someone to write a question about this? What is the new thing on the news that actually landed this question as something we're talking about today? So in this particular speech, I'm talking about how the Biden administration, in things like the State of the Union address, has focused on democracy. And despite that, recent ABC polling finds that 82% of Americans don't trust democracy in the United States. All of those are taking the original part of my background. Oh, that democracy is something that people are worried about, and updates it. So, okay, this is what the Biden administration is doing. This is why people are still not content. And that transitions very smoothly into the next part, which is why should we care? Why should we be worried about this right now? So when you're prepping a background, every speech is going to look a little bit different, but you always want to structure it somewhat like this, where you're starting with the big sweeping, okay, I'm going to catch my viewer up to what we're talking about in this question. And then the second part is, what is it precisely that makes this question necessary? And what is it now that you need to know in order to be fully informed as you continue to give the speech? Another thing that you want to focus on in the background, just excuse me for a second, I'm plugging in my computer. Another thing you want to focus on in the background is making good impressions, good first impressions, whenever you can. So the background is a great opportunity to establish some credibility via sourcing. I try to do this to an extent by bringing up the Brookings Institute, which is a very reputable think tank, as my first source. But someone who does this really well is Anthony, the IX champion from the same year, who cites a very kind of credible and unique and a source that's going to stand out. I think it was the Arms Control Association in his background. So by establishing that you're someone who has a strong command of sources and is able to kind of impress with your sourcing, that impression lasts for the rest of the speech. And it's something you don't need to work as hard on by the time you get to your third point. So that's also something to keep in mind with the background. For everything like sourcing and word choice even, establishing that you have a strong vocabulary and good command of the lingo on the topic, all of that contributes to a strong background and a good first impression on the judge.
Presidential election coming up, where we have to choose between a candidate who's not exactly inspiring and the man who inspired the reason we're worried about democracy altogether. But understanding that, and understanding that it's important to know the state of our democracy so we can preserve it, it becomes imperative to ask the question.
Okay. The next part here is short but incredibly important. The statement of significance, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's the statement of the significance of your speech. We give this allocated time right before you say the question as a bit of a plea for the judges, or many judges' attention. you're essentially saying that this is the one particular reason, if you're only able to give one, that the next 5 minutes or so are valuable, that it's worth the judge's time to actually pay attention. Now, similar to an AGD, there are many, many different ways you can go about delivering an AGD. And there are many different equally valid styles or approaches you can use to leave that impression and to succeed in that plea for attention. Something that some people like and other people don't is something that's rhetorically strong or poetic, which is what I was trying to go with here. I was using a little bit of wordplay with the man who's not exactly inspiring versus the man who inspired the reason we're worried about democracy to begin with. That's something that sticks in a judge's mind, even if it's not specific or necessarily as empiric or objective as something like an impact is. An impact is also a great example of something you can use for a statement of significance. That's kind of an opportunity to harness your inner public forum debater and to really give the judge a sense of urgency. There are a few things that can do that more effectively than explaining how many people are going to die instantaneously should nuclear war break out over Taiwan. There are other ways that are slightly more nuanced that you can approach the statement of significance as well. Sometimes it's really helpful to reframe or recontextualize the issue in the judge's mind. This goes a little bit along the lines of impact, but typically when you're talking about an impact, you're focused on something that is the logical conclusion of the topic of your speech. However, if you find an opportunity to kind of reroute or give the judge a new insight that maybe they didn't previously consider, that can stick out to them as well. Something similarly that can work in some cases, but not all, is using a narrative or a personal and emotional story as part of your statement of significance. It's kind of the opposite approach of an impact, but it can elicit similar emotions. So instead of going big and kind of forcing your judge to recognize just how important the issue is, you can narrow in on one particular person or one particular group so the judge feels that consequence. The goal of all of these different options, whether it's something that's, poetic and is going to stand out in their mind to an impact that really drives home the importance of the issue, is to make sure your judge understands why what you're talking about is valuable and why it should matter to them. And that's a mistake that a lot of people make with the SOS, is they use it as a throwaway, when really it should be an integral part of making your speech make sense. So that's what I tried to focus on here, is framing my SOS in a way that people would understand, but would also make them think about it a little bit more. Because at this period of time, this was June of this year, so election coverage was everywhere, most people understood that democracy was an issue that people were worried about. So adding in some sort of statistic like, okay, for the 330 some odd million Americans, this is a really big deal. The audience already knows that, so that's boring to them. That's not new information. What I decided to do instead here is try to just phrase my wording in such a way that it wouldn't leave their minds through the rest of the speech. I hope I accomplished that, but that's just an example of how you can use different either rhetorical or impact and statistic-focused strategies to make an impact on the judge.
Are the institutions of United States democracy rising to the challenge of the current political era? And the answer is tragically no. Our most major institutions are losing their democratic character. First, voting protections at the state level. Second, the Supreme Court. And third and finally, media and information.
So, I want to get into a little bit, not just about how I answered the question, but also the particularly unique context around answering the question in Nats finals. So the advice that I had gotten multiple times before I actually went in to deliver the speech and before I drew the question is that in a final round, and particularly in Nats finals, in front of thousands of people in the audience, whenever you can, you want to be an optimist. It goes a little bit to this thought process of, for lack of a better term, like final round main character energy, where you want to be the person who really captures the heart of the audience. And the best way to do that is not by telling them that all hope is lost. And that kind of goes to the fact that Nats finals, but all final rounds too, are pretty unique. You're in front of a much bigger audience than just one judge at a local. And the content that you choose to either include or omit from your speech is much more important than it is normally. Because when you're in a lower stakes round, or the competition is maybe a little bit less stiff, the difference is that if you give a really good speech, but it's absolutely boring, it's probably still going to be a 1 or a 2. You can give a fantastic speech on like kitchen table economic issues, something like inflation, that doesn't really stand out or carry any sort of emotional baggage to it, but it can still see you tremendous success if the speech is well done. In Nats finals, however, what your speech is about is just as important as how well you execute that. And I talked to other people in the final round who I watched, because I was the 6th speaker, spend a pretty significant amount of time deciding which question to draw for that exact reason. Because the question you pick of the 3 can have a massive bearing on where you end up placing. Not because you're going to answer one question well and one question poorly, but because some of your fate is already decided just by what the content of the speech is. The next piece of this that's important and unique to Nats that I think is interesting to discuss is that the zeitgeist of the time, the vibe, the current political environment can be really important to how the speech is received. And that also goes to having an audience of thousands of people whose emotions and perspectives kind of play into this too. I think the best way to illustrate this is with Peter Aliski's 2022 US final speech, where he is giving a speech about whether or not gun control legislation can succeed in Congress just a couple weeks after the Uvalde shooting. So that topic and that speech was very impactful for that audience, probably more so than it would have been at pretty much any other time in history. So that speech is carried not just by how excellently he delivered it, but also by the emotion that kind of was beyond what was happening in the room. So anytime you're in front of a bigger audience, because this doesn't just have to be Nats finals, it can also be local finals or districts or a national circuit final that has a large room full of people. It's important to keep that audience in mind, because how they perceive and how they receive your speech can have a really big impact on how the judges are understanding what you're saying. Another thing here too that I think is worth mentioning is that luck can be a little bit of a factor too. I ended up having a kind of unique experience with how my speech fit into the round. I was the 6th speaker, so I was giving the last speech in the round. I only saw one other speech, which was Brayson's, the first speaker's, about the Chevron doctrine and the Supreme Court. I didn't know it when I was creating my speech, but I accidentally gathered some credibility by summarizing the rest of the round. So my 3 points talk about voting protections, the Supreme Court, and media and information. It just so happens that other people in that same round had each of those as the focus of their entire speech. So one person had a speech that was all about voting in the United States. Another person talked about social media and political polarization and how the media environment is worsening. Brayson talked about the Supreme Court. So my speech ended up ending that round, but also reinforcing the things that people had previously gone into detail. I had no control over the fact that that was going to happen. So in a way, that was a little bit of luck that did help me out. And then you can look at someone like Peter, who had the opposite type of luck. He drew a question about gun control at a time where it was incredibly poignant, and the rest of his round was full of econ questions. So when you compare those two things, it's almost going to be difficult for a judge to vote for an econ speech that blends in rather than one that stands out. So it may seem like I'm telling you that luck can throw you off and, the question that you draw can have a massive bearing on this. But what I'm trying to say here is that capitalize on that opportunity and set yourself up for that luck whenever you can. So if you draw 2 questions, a speech about gun control and a speech about inflation, in that final round, take the risk on the gun control speech, or take the speech that seems to be very meta, very encompassing, like about democracy in the United States, when you know that it's a USX final round focusing on the biggest issues of the day, because that's how you poise yourself for making sure that the question you're answering is the one that the audience wants to hear at that moment and at that point in the round.
One of the most important aspects of American democracy is the idea of one person, one vote. But recently, state legislators have been trying to take away both of those things, which is why the first reason that the institutions of United States democracy are not rising to the current challenges is because of the degradation of voting protections on the state level.
So, at the beginning of each of your points, you have what's called an on top, which is basically like a mini AGD. It's a little introduction, it's a little moment of levity leading into your next point and hopefully building some context. The single biggest thing to know about on tops is that they don't all have to be perfect. The one I delivered at the top of the first point, in hindsight, honestly doesn't make that much sense. But that's okay, because ultimately the function of the on top is not how perfectly flawless your humor is or how clever the pun you make is. It's designed to have an effect on your audience and on your judge. What you're trying to do is take this long, serious, and sometimes a little bit boring speech and break it up in such a way that your judge is refreshed for your next point. Humor is often used in on-tops for that exact purpose, because there's no better way to lighten up the room than by having everyone laugh. But humor is something that can vary from audience to audience. So what's important about humor is understanding who it is that you're talking to and how they're going to receive something. I mentioned the whole setup punchline style of joke previously, and that's a really good example of something that works with some audiences, particularly big ones, and not other ones, particularly single judges or maybe two judges. Because any sort of setup punchline requires a big laugh to actually make sense. That doesn't mean you can't use one in front of a smaller audience, but it does mean that you're going to have to prepare yourself for a slightly different reception to the joke that you made. The other thing that goes along with this is dramatic pauses. Extemp speeches are full of dramatic pauses, and what I tried to do very deliberately in this speech is to pause for longer than I thought that I had to. So every time I'm transitioning from a point to a point, or delivering a line that I think is particularly impactful, I wait longer than what feels right, just slightly, because what feels long for the person who's actually delivering the speech is actually just the right amount of time for the judge. The analogy that I think of when I'm trying to visualize or rationalize how these pauses are supposed to work is the way that diction works when you're performing in a choir. So one of the things that you'll often be told if you sing is that you need to over-enunciate, because what sounds like too much consonants and too much enunciation to you is the right amount to the audience who is trying to focus in on that and doesn't have your immediate perspective. So extempors are essentially performers in that regard. And when you're under the pressure of having so many people, or even just one or two people watching you, those moments where you're just pausing, where it's dead silence, can feel really stressful. And that's why so many people, even people in Nats finals, will rush through it. But that's why every time you're taking the opportunity to deliver something that needs to land, wait for it to land. Smile if you're telling a joke. Kind of use your facial expressions and body language to communicate what the audience is supposed to be feeling, and they're more likely to receive it that way. You're in control of those different moments, and you can't relinquish them because of stress or fear. Okay, so the 3 points that I rattled off previously in the speech: voting, the Supreme Court, and media and information. The reason that I go through these points here before I actually get into them is because the order of your points absolutely does matter. And I can attest to this. This isn't just some sort of extempor community thing where we're in an echo chamber and all making this assumption for ourselves and judges don't actually care. I got very explicit comments for one of my Harvard Octo speech last year where judges lowered my ranks because I gave what would have been the obvious point, the one that most judges would have anticipated I talked about first, last. So they spent the majority of my speech just asking themselves, wait, where is this point? Why hasn't she gotten to the important part yet? When in reality, I had that important content in my speech, I just put it too late. So the way that I was taught to order points and what I tried to do in this speech is what is called the de me ha philosophy. Right? It's catchy, but it serves a purpose. So your first point is the one that should make the audience go, duh. It's the most obvious, it's the most direct, it's the most immediately connected to the subject of the speech. So here, my first point is about voting. When you're talking about democratic institutions, voting is a really clear and direct connection. You're talking about people's ability to participate in democracy. So if I had stuck that point last and started with, say, the Supreme Court, my audience would have been like, well, when are you going to talk about voting? We're waiting for it. So you don't want to keep the very obvious stuff, the stuff that could almost go in the background, for the very end. The second point is the meh point. It's the one that you feel the least confident about for any reason. It could be that you think your logic or the connection of your thoughts is a little dubious. It could be that you think your impact is a little bit weaker. Regardless, you want to stick it in the middle because you don't want your weakest point to be the one you start on to give a bad first impression, and you don't want it to be the one you end on to leave your judge on a bad note. So in most cases, the place to stick your weaker point is in the middle. So for me, my second point was about the Supreme Court. And the reason that I put it in the middle is because I felt like it was a little bit more dubious than the other ones. Because I wasn't arguing necessarily that the Supreme Court was an inherently bad institution, but rather that the problem with it was how far it had diverged from the perspective of the people, where it didn't really reflect our current understanding of the Constitution. And in order to articulate that, I needed a little bit of a stronger and more nuanced argument to actually sell the judges on that. The other issue with this particular point, and this is something that you run into with USX speeches a lot, is that the take that the Supreme Court is anti-democratic can be construed as a little bit more partisan and a little bit more fear-mongery. So I didn't want the last thing I said in this speech to make me come off as a political partisan hack rather than someone who is a little bit more bigger picture when you're speaking to that many thousands of people. So then speaking of the third point, you want that one to be your point. This should be the intriguing one. If you have a point that's a little bit weird but really interesting, that's where you put it. Because by this point in the speech, you've established most of the fundamentals, most of the basics. So you don't need to give the audience or the judge the obvious point anymore. You give them the one that makes them think and makes them Google after the speech something, oh, I didn't think of that before. Oh, that's a really interesting perspective. Oh, I didn't really realize that that was connected. So for me, I put my point about media and information third, partly because the other two fit best in 1 and 2, so this process of elimination made sense for 3, but also because the media and the distribution of information isn't necessarily what most people think of immediately when it comes to democratic institutions. So I was leaning in on the unconventional aspect of the third point, which was that if I started with media, it would have felt a little bit strange, like that isn't where your mind goes immediately. So I put it in the third point, so hopefully that confusion would be rerouted as intrigue.
The Center for American Progress explains on March 25th of this year that some of the biggest triumphs of our democratic institutions have been in the field of voting protections. In fact, the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments, and the Women's Suffrage Amendments represent some of the biggest strides forward in both voting and democracy. Beyond that, there's federal legislation that's designed to prevent any interference with voting. But ultimately, state governments have decided that that's not the way they want to go. The Brennan Center for Justice explains on June 14th of this year that from just January 1st to March 29th of 2023, 15 different states passed 18 pieces of legislation, all of which made it harder to vote, between restricting mail-in voting and voter registration altogether. And considering that the Pew Research Center explains that only 2/3 of Americans vote in presidential elections to begin with, ultimately these state governments are sabotaging our democracy by making it harder for us to have a voice in it.
So that's the remainder of my first point after the little bit that I cut off at the beginning. Again, I typed out pretty much exactly what my flow looked like with, some capitalizations added, so that way it's easier to visualize what it is that I'm talking about. So we started with the on top, the one person, one vote thing. Then I restate, and I always do this because I think it helps with clarifying to a judge what it is that you're talking about and reminding them what your points are, exactly what the tag is. Then we have my A subpoint, B subpoint, and C subpoint. When I'm doing this speech, I follow a little bit of a past, present, impact style of substructure. So typically when people are talking about substructure or the way that you organize or follow the map of your logical thought process within each point, they'll either say past, present, future, or status quo, change, impact as different strategies or outlines that you can use. I kind of combined those two for the purpose of this speech because I wasn't necessarily talking about the future. I was more talking about the result of the problems that had already occurred within the A subpoint and B subpoint. The reason that I say past and present is because, particularly for this speech, and more so than I think most people do generally, I leaned really heavily on historical information for the A subpoint. So here I'm talking about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. In the future, I talk about previous Supreme Court compositions. And that was a choice that I made for this speech because it felt so broad and encompassing that I thought it was a good idea to use a little bit of the historical knowledge that I knew the audience would be aware of as part of the actual content of my speech. Because there's a lot of instances in which you can actually win yourself favor with a judge or an audience by making them feel smart. This is something that people will often suggest doing in the background and is really a great idea and something I tried to do here, which is you want to hint at what your answer is going to be before you explicitly state it. So the way that you change your voice inflection or the word choice that you use can imply to the judge how you're going to answer the question. And then, if you answer the question the way they're expecting you to, you make them feel smart by them having properly guessed what it is that you were going to be saying. So, in this particular speech, instead of trying to use more current examples, I leaned a little bit more on the collective historical knowledge that I knew most of the audience was going to have, because it kind of biases them in favor of the content of the speech when they share this perspective because they remember it from their history classes. So that was how I broke this down, and I also want to highlight the C subpoint because one of the best things you can do when you have the opportunity is to have a specific source in your C subpoint as part of an impact, or if not an impact, just a little bit more specificity. So here I'm talking about how states are making it harder to vote, but then my C subpoint kind of changes the perspective there by me basically saying, only 2/3 of people vote in presidential elections already. So this is making it even harder for us to do the thing that we can barely muster the energy to do in the first place. And that's something that you can always do in an impact, and something I find very effective, is instead of just following the logical conclusion of, oh, okay, this many fewer million people will be able to vote in the next election. What you can take it to is, I've already given you that information. The fact that less people will be able to vote is a logical conclusion, so it doesn't necessarily need to be stated again, but here's another way I can change your perspective and add to it, broaden and deepen what you get from this point. So that's what I tried to do here by talking a little bit about voter apathy and how this capitalizes on it for the gain and the advantage of those state legislators.
In 1893, the United States Supreme Court made what was quite possibly the most consequential decision of their entire existence. In a 9-0 unanimous ruling, they decided that a tomato is a vegetable and not a fruit. But today they have some slightly more serious things to worry about, and we're all worried too. Which is why the second reason that the institutions of United States democracy are not rising to the current challenge is because of the behavior of the Supreme Court. The New York State Bar Association explains on October 31st of last year that the current Supreme Court is a bit of a spooky prospect. They're currently a 6-3 conservative majority and have made some very controversial rulings on things from abortion to gun control. But while a conservative Supreme Court isn't inherently anti-democratic, just look to the extremely liberal Warren Court of the mid-20th century, there's a bigger problem here. And that's that YouGov polling from March 12th of this year identifies that they're entirely out of step with Americans. In fact, 3/4 of Democrats and 50% of Republicans believe that the Supreme Court's decisions are too politicized. And considering that Supreme Court justices are appointed rather than elected, this is an abuse of the trust of the American people. In just the next few days, the Supreme Court will decide on major cases like the Chevron doctrine that may even interfere with the way the government functions altogether, demonstrating clearly that the Supreme Court is abusing their privilege over us and our democracy.
I follow a pretty similar structure to the first point. Right? I like to be consistent with the substructure for my points. We start with the on top about the tomato ruling, then the Supreme Court is the tagline. I talk about the historical Warren Court and the current state of the Supreme Court with the A subpoint, the B subpoint why that's a problem to democracy, and the C looks a little bit forward. What I wanted to point out here is the C subpoint was a little bit of a different approach than the first point, because the first point was kind of more traditional. I used a statistic, tried to recontextualize the perspective. Here, however, the suggestion that I make is take opportunities and risks whenever you see them, because they can often help you in ways you don't expect. So the way this applies is that I was the sixth speaker. So before I did the speech, I watched and cross-examined Brayson's speech, the first speaker. He was talking about the Supreme Court's rulings for this year, and his question was something along the lines of, what will be the most significant Supreme Court ruling in this term? And he talked about the overturning of the Chevron doctrine, which basically changes how government bureaucracy functions and what the power of the government bureaucracy looks like. So I was able to take something that had already been discussed at length in the round, the fact that the Chevron doctrine ruling that was going to happen in the coming days would probably be very problematic, and bring it up in my own speech. This kind of goes to the credibility adding thing I mentioned previously, which accidentally I got credibility from other people talking about the points of my speech without my knowledge in the round, but here I did it intentionally, where I knew that Chevron had been something that we discussed substantially, and I brought it back in a way where the audience would be like, oh, I remember that. So while that's not going to be something that happens all of the time in speeches, especially because cross-examination isn't necessarily prevalent depending on where you live in the country, take opportunities to bring up things that are going to be relevant to the audience, or to make them be like, oh, I saw that on the front page of the news this morning, or oh, there was another speaker who was talking about that before. Because anything that can make you stand out in that way is a benefit. It makes the audience and judge feel more knowledgeable, and it makes you come off as having a greater command over what's happening in the world right now. Speaking of what's happening in the world right now, being timely and realistic with impacts can be absolutely critical, especially if they're not a very empirics-focused impact. So here, I very intentionally included in the next few days in how I was describing the Supreme Court's upcoming decisions, because that's something that makes the impact feel very immediate and real to the people that are watching. So if you're doing something that's a little bit more rhetorical, it's almost always a good idea to make it really feel tangible to the judge, because that's the problem with rhetorical impacts, is they can feel a little bit wishy-washy and not something that's truly connected to an event that's going to occur as a result of this point. So using language like that can make the judges really recognize that this is important, even if there isn't a statistic affiliated with it.
During the Democratic primary election, a series of AI-generated robocalls were sent out to homes in New Hampshire. These robocalls had President Biden saying that voters shouldn't come out to vote in the primary. They should instead save their energy for the general election. And considering that Biden's supporters don't even want to vote for him to begin with, that was a bit of a problem. But the bigger problem is that increasingly, Americans don't know what to believe, which is why the third reason that American institutions of democracy are not rising to the current challenge is because of struggles with media and information. A Freedom House 2023 report explains that the media is one of the most substantial checks on the rise of authoritarian powers that exist. Just look to American history, when the release of the Pentagon Papers exposed corruption in our own government, and that we were concealing information about the war that our young men were fighting in. Today, look overseas to countries like China and South Africa, where journalists are risking their lives to expose corruption and abuse of their own governments. But in the United States, where we have the ability to have a free and effective press, we take it for granted. The Associated Press explains on July 27th of last year that currently, Americans are becoming increasingly distrustful of the media, and they're turning increasingly to social media, which uses algorithms to boost misinformation and doubt in each other. As America becomes more polarized and media doesn't serve as an effective check on the rise of authoritarian powers, an authoritarian could creep up right under our noses, and we'd be none the wiser.
Here's the third point. And it's maybe a little bit different than the other two for a couple of reasons. So I start the A and B subpoints a little bit similar to the previous two, where I'm talking about the history of America, the Pentagon Papers, something that pretty much everyone in the audience knows about, and then making connections to current day journalists who are risking their lives for the sake of the freedom of the press. Then I talk about social media algorithms and how we're losing the credibility of media and information today. My C subpoint is rhetorically strong, but weak on specificity. And this is actually because when you're doing the national final speeches, there's someone at the judges' table who's holding up sheets that have the time signals for you. You're allowed technically to go over the 7 minutes and 30 seconds, but they tell you not to abuse it. And when I was watching these time signals, I panicked and misunderstood the one that I got, so I thought I was a minute farther into my time than I actually was, and I was worried that I was abusing the time too much, so I kind of rushed the specificity that I was intending to have in the social media algorithms point. But I still liked the authoritarian or the extra gestures or hand signals that I used to try to communicate a greater message in the C subpoint. It's an example of how you don't necessarily need to have a specific impact for an impact to be, oh, it's too many impacts in one sentence. I was going to say an impact to be impactful. You can communicate urgency and exigency without having statistics to back it up, but you need to compensate in some way with some really strong rhetoric or some other way to illustrate just how important this is. Looking back on this now, this is something that I wish I could change about the speech, and probably the first thing that I would change. I would have included, in addition to this rhetoric, some sort of statistic that illustrates just how fast this change is occurring. So, for instance, the United States was ranked 42nd on the Reporters Without Borders Index of Press Freedom, which is really, really bad for a country that hails itself as this bastion of freedom of the press, and simultaneously was ranked as a flawed democracy by the Economist Intelligence Unit. So in hindsight, I would have connected those two things and explained how that creates the opportunity for an authoritarian leader to creep right under our noses. Something like that would supplement the specificity without taking away from the rhetoric, and it is something I wish I could go back and change. But ultimately, don't think that rhetorical flourishes are useless, because in this particular case, it kind of saved me when otherwise the end of my point would have been weaker.
So when we return to today's question, are the institutions of United States democracy rising to the challenge of the current political era? The answer is tragically no, because our most major institutions are losing their democratic character. First, voting, particularly on the state level. Second, the Supreme Court. And third and finally, media and information that is dividing us rather than uniting us. Ultimately, AMLO may have gone a little bit far in saying that there is more democracy in Mexico than in the United States, female presidents aside. But as a nation, we cannot let that stand. Ultimately, if our institutions aren't going to fight for our democracy, we can do it ourselves. and we will at the ballot box this November. Thank you.
Okay, and that's the end of my speech. I don't actually have another slide here, but I'm just going to go through some final thoughts before I wrap this up. So I realized that I didn't fully finish what I was saying about the advice that I had gotten about a speech on the national final stage going into it. I mentioned that I was told multiple times that you have to be an optimist. And that advice kind of contradicts the way that I approached this, seemingly at least, because I said no. I said that democracy is flawed in the United States, which, when you're giving a speech to that many people, is kind of being a bit of a downer. So what I wanted to instill here is there are multiple ways to take the kind of rising together optimist approach. And it doesn't need to be this sort of toxic positivity. Because ultimately, the reason that I didn't say, yes, everything is fine and dandy about democracy is because I felt like I would be lying to people. And you don't want to start a speech focusing on content that you know your judge is going to think is wrong. That's generally a really bad idea. So I ended up going with what I thought was more realistic, if not a little bit more depressing, the fact that democracy is flawed and possibly getting worse. But the way that I compensated for this was by framing the end of my speech as a call to action. I quite literally said, we will fix this at the ballot box this November, which aged wonderfully. But essentially, I was saying, this is a problem. This exists. We're going to acknowledge it, but we can change it. And that's a philosophy that's always great to follow when it comes to any sort of downer speech. Because if you're talking about something like gun violence or something like mass human rights violations around the world, being too aggressively optimistic about that is going to come off worse than just being pessimistic. But what you can do instead is, instead of dwelling substantially on how severe the harms are, you can reframe it emotionally so that it inspires your judge nonetheless. So if you're talking about how heinous human rights abuses are in some parts of the world, or how some governments don't respect their citizens, or how democracy is dissolving in front of our eyes, you can frame it in such a way that's, we should all be angry about this. We can all contribute to fixing this. And in that way, there's really no such thing as a speech that's too depressing, if you give the judge the emotional framework or the emotional blueprint to know what to do with the sad information. So that's the strategy that I followed, and I think that's something you can do with any final round. Don't be scared of a negative answer. Just find the other places within the speech that you can bring up positive emotions and lean in on that. The second thing that I wanted to kind of say here before I end is that this was my first national circuit final round ever. The first time I had ever done cross-examination at a tournament was semifinals at nationals. So this was my third time. And the reason I bring this up is absolutely not to brag, but to tell anyone who's watching this and is struggling to break through to the next level that it is absolutely possible. And it isn't necessarily that some people are just going to be so much more experienced and have been in finals forever and that you can never kind of crack into that next level. It is absolutely possible, and it requires the confidence to not assume that you can't make it to the next round. What I noticed changing about my mindset from previous tournaments to this particular tournament was that I was just enjoying each round for the sake of it, rather than assuming that I wasn't going to advance because I didn't think myself capable of it. And clearly, it changed something about my performance or the way that I carried myself in front of the judges. But I think it's an important lesson, especially for Extemp, which can be, you keep hearing the same names finaling at tournaments, and if you're not one of those names, it's very easy to feel as though you will never be one of those names. I just wanted to point out quickly that that isn't true from my own personal experience. And if you put in that sort of dedication and work and have that faith in yourself, everyone gets their moment where they see the kind of success that they know they've been practicing for. So with that, that is my USX 2024 National Finals winning speech. I hope this was helpful, and yeah, Equality in Forensics is a fantastic resource, and please check out Anthony's analysis too if you haven't already. Bye, guys!